Picture this. It's the year 1780. A cavalry of 10,000 horsemen thunders across the West African savannah, their spears glinting in the harsh sunlight. The ground trembles beneath their horses' hooves. Villages empty at the mere rumor of their approach. Kingdoms twice their size send tributes rather than face them in battle. This is the army of Oyo, and for nearly 8 centuries, these 3 syllables struck fear into the hearts of rulers from the forests of modern-day Nigeria to the coasts of Benin. Yet today, if you ask most people about the great African empires, they'll mention Mali, Songhai, perhaps ancient Egypt. But Oyo? The name draws blank stares. How did an empire that once controlled 18,000 square miles, an area larger than Switzerland, with a population greater than 1 million, simply vanish from our collective memory? This is the story of the Oyo Empire, a tale of power and betrayal, of tradition and transformation, of an empire that rose from the ashes of invasion to become West Africa's greatest military force, only to tear itself apart from within. This is a story that deserves to be told. The origins of Oyo are shrouded in mystery and myth, the kind of mystery that makes historians pull their hair out and storytellers smile. Historical findings place the reign of the Oyo Empire from the 10th century up until the 18th century. But the origin story? That's where things get complicated. Was the empire founded by Oranmiyan, or was it Sango, the god of thunder himself, who walked the earth as a king? Some accounts claim the founding father came from Mecca after being banished for abandoning Islam. Others say he came from Medina. Even the identity of the first Alafin is contested. Some believe it was Oranmiyan, some believe it was Sango, and others believe it was Aganju. The truth? We may never know for certain. But here's the version that's widely accepted. Oranmiyan came from Ile-Ife, the sacred city and origin place of the Yoruba people. He was assisted by a Bariba king, where he married a Nupe princess. The king gave him a magical serpent. "Follow this serpent," the king told him. "Where it stops, build your kingdom." The serpent slithered through forests and across rivers, finally coiling to rest at a spot in the savannah. Oranmiyan named it Oyo Ile, and there, one of Africa's mightiest empires was born. In another account, the first capital of the Oyo Empire was Oko, but was later moved to Oyo Ile by Sango. But Oyo's early years weren't glorious. In fact, we know almost nothing about the empire from the 10th century to the 16th century. Why? Because during those centuries, Oyo faced its first existential crisis. The Nupe kingdom, led by a cunning chieftain named Etsujiga, swept down from the north like a storm. Etsujiga had successfully unified all small Nupe chieftaincies under a single kingdom, making him a formidable force. During the reign of Alafin Onigbogi, the Nupe invaded and conquered Oyo Ile, forcing the survivors to flee. For decades, the once proud empire existed in exile, its people scattered, its capital occupied, its future uncertain. Imagine that, an empire barely born, already on the brink of extinction. But the Yoruba have a saying, however far the stream flows, it never forgets its source. And Oyo would remember. It was under Alafin Ofinran that the Nupes, who had invaded Oyo, were finally defeated, and under Alafin Egonoju, Igboho was named the new capital until the reign of Alafin Ajiboyede, who gradually started returning the capital to Oyo Ile. However, the real resurrection occurred in the early 17th century when a new Alafin named Abipa ascended to power. He was done with exile, done with humiliation. Abipa gathered his people, marched back to Oyo Ile, and reoccupied it. But he didn't stop there. He pushed eastwards into Igbomina territory and southeast to the river Osun, reclaiming lands and sending a message: Oyo was back. Under Alafin Obaokun, there were further expansion attempts into Ijesa land, Ekiti, and the kingdoms of Ondo and Idanre, but these campaigns were all decisively defeated. The dense forests of eastern Yoruba land proved difficult for Oyo's cavalry. The real architect of Oyo's imperial expansion, though, was Alafin Ajagbo. Some call him the true founder of the empire, not in the mythical sense, but in the practical, blood and iron sense. Under Ajagbo, Oyo conquered southward and westward, successfully bringing Egbaland, Ijebu, and the Onko area under Oyo rule. He also successfully raided the Igun state of the Weme kingdom, making sure they felt the military power of Oyo. But Ajagbo's most important innovation was military. He created a new war title, the Are-Ona-Kakanfo, Chief of the Ona-Kakanfo, or Chief of the Chiefs of Kakanfo. This was the commander-in-chief of the provincial armies, a position so critical, so dangerous, that if its holder failed to win a campaign within 3 months, he was expected to commit suicide. Think about that. 3 months to victory or death. That was the Oyo way. Under Alafin Ojigi in the 1730s, Oyo subdued the kingdom of Dahomey, a conquest we'll explore in detail. Other notable rulers who carried out successful expansion were Alafin Gberu and Basorun Gaha. By the 18th century, under Alafin Abiodun, Oyo had reached its zenith. The empire stretched across both Yoruba-speaking groups and other tribes, controlling all Yoruba kingdoms, Benin, the Popos, Dahomey, parts of Nupe, and the Baribas. In present-day terms, this influence covered southwestern Nigeria, central and northern Togo, southeastern Benin, southwestern Niger, and western Cameroon. 18,000 square miles with over 1 million people. Oyo wasn't just an empire, it was the empire of West Africa. But how did they do it? How does an empire control such vast territories in an age before phones, telegraphs, or even reliable maps? The answer lies in Oyo's brilliant and brutal political system. The fundamental unit of Yoruba political organization was the town. Yoruba towns were largely autonomous city-states, each having their own hereditary ruler. But these rulers recognized the overall authority of the king of the capital city. The Alafin of Oyo was first the king of the city of Oyo and secondarily the ruler of the Oyo Empire. At the heart was the Alafin, the divine king, believed to be the reincarnation of Sango, the god of thunder. He was given the traditional title of Ekeji Orisa, companion of the gods. He lived in the Oke Afin, or Afin, a palace complex situated on massive areas of land, not less than a square mile, surrounded by thousands of slaves called Eru Oba, the king's slaves, who served him in ceremonial and administrative duties. The Alafin was only seen outside the Oke Afin 3 times a year during important festivals: the Mole festival in honor of Ifa, the god of divination, the Orun festival, where the Alafin made sacrifices asking if the gods approved his continuous reign, and the Bere festival, where he received tributes of bere leaves from the chiefs for thatching the palace roofs. The Alafin controlled the Sango cult and was the ultimate judicial authority in Oyo. Any disputes that could not be handled by the chiefs were brought to him. He was the only person who could sanction an execution. He controlled the succession of chiefly titles, having the power to create new titles, depose chiefs, and confer and install chiefs. But here's the twist. The Alafin wasn't a dictator. He ruled alongside the Oyo Mesi, a council of 7 powerful chiefs who formed an advisory council to the Alafin. These weren't yes-men, they were power brokers, led by the Basorun, who could make or break a king. In Oyo, political power stayed with these senior chiefs called Oloyes. The Oloyes were chosen based on their power, and power in the Oyo Empire was measured by one's ability to control vast resources, especially human resources. To amass a massive following of loyal men required buying gifts, purchasing slaves and wives, which demanded massive wealth. This following was usually passed down after the Oloye died, so the mantle of being an Oloye was mostly inherited, not created. The political system was founded upon the Idile lineage, a large family formed by the patrilineal descendants of a single man, the founder of the lineage. These large families, averaging about 50 people, usually stayed in one compound called Agbo Ile, though some families were so large they occupied multiple compounds. Members were bound by common economic interests, farms, lands, livestock. The eldest surviving male member served as head and was called Bale. Adjacent compounds merged to form wards called Adugbo. These wards were under the authority of the most important chief residing in the ward. The larger a ward, the more powerful and political influence their chiefs had. Allegiances of wards to their chiefs were fluid. Wards could transfer their allegiance to one chief to another, either by choice or by orders of the Alafin. This caused allegiances to be lobbied through gifts and political favors. The wards in the Oyo Empire were divided into 3 distinct sections. First, the area of the king's palace, known as Afin or Oke-Afin. This contained numerous compounds of slave officials who performed different tasks from ceremonial to administrative duties. Second, the ward of the royal lineages, further divided into 3 principal royal wards, the Aremo ward, Ona-Isokun ward, and the Baba Iyaji ward. Third, the ward occupied by the free Oyo of non-royal lineage under the control of non-royal chiefs. The first son of the Alafin was known as the Aremo and was initially the heir to the throne, until the reign of Alafin Ojigi in the 1730s. After Ojigi, a dark tradition began. The Aremo was required to commit suicide after the Alafin died, and the successor was picked from the larger group of chiefs. The reason? Suspicions that Aremos were hastening to ascend the throne through patricide, killing their fathers. It wasn't until the 1800s that this practice was discontinued, but even then, the Aremo was not given explicit right to the throne after the Alafin died. The Aremo usually controlled a large ward of the city, sharing power with the Alafin. He was seen as the king for the public, while the Alafin was seen as the king of the palace. Palace officials were divided into 3 groups: titled officers, Ilari, and Iwefa, the eunuchs. The Iwefa were the highest in rank, tasked with protecting the Alafin's wives and children. 3 Iwefas lived outside the Oke-Afin and were, in order of rank, Ona-Iwefa, eunuch of the middle, Otun-Iwefa, eunuch of the right, and Osi-Iwefa, eunuch of the left. The Ona-Iwefa took the Alafin's place in giving judicial decisions. The Otun-Iwefa had charge of the Sango cult, supervising the principal Sango shrine in the suburban hamlet of Koso. The Osi-Iwefa was responsible for collecting the Alafin's revenues and could represent the Alafin when dealing with other Oyo chiefs. The Ilari, also called Are, comprised both male and female slaves, numbering in their hundreds. The name Ilari meant scar-head, alluding to the fact that they had scarifications on their heads with magical substances inserted in those incisions. They were under the authority of the Osi-Iwefa. Male Ilari served as bodyguards for the Alafin and as messengers between the palace and the outside world. They were headed by the Are-Apeka, also called Olori Eru, head of slaves, who answered to the Osi Iwefa. The titled officers carried out administrative and ritual functions. One of the most revered was the Olokun Esin, master of horse, responsible for maintaining the palace stables. He lived outside the palace, but went daily to supervise the stable slaves. It's important to note that all palace officers were slaves by title, not by origin. It was normal for free non-royal Oyo descendants to enter the Alafin for service or to be registered there as children. Emasculation was only approved by the Alafin and was done on people convicted of sexual offenses, bestiality, theft, and adultery with the Alafin's wives. Senior palace titles were by promotion or merit, except for some hereditary titles like the Olokun Esin and Arokin. The Olokun Esin, the Samu, the Onisare, and the Osi Iwefa were among the Abobaku, those required to commit suicide when the Alafin died, ensuring these positions remained vacant so successors could be chosen by the new Alafin. The tenure of the Ilari also ended with the Alafin's death and could be continued or reshuffled by the new ruler. The female slaves were crucial to palace duties. The most important was the Iya Oba, the king's mother. In earlier periods, this title was reserved for the Alafin's actual mother, but just like the Aremo, the Iya Oba was subsequently required to commit suicide when the Alafin died, and the position was filled by appointment from palace women. The second most important title was the Iya Kere, the Little Mother, in charge of the Alafin's regalia and a female Ilari. The female palace officials and female Ilari were collectively known as the Ayaba or Aya Oba. Due to large-scale polygyny in Oyo, the Omo Oba, children of the king, were so numerous they formed a substantial minority population of the city, holding powerful positions. Beyond the Aremo, there were titles like the fathers of the king, who were in charge of the Ona Isokun, Ona Akan, and Ona Omo Ola branches. There were also the brothers of the king, lesser titles, with the most important being the Baba Iyaji. These lesser titles were created for the Isokun branch of the royal lineage, which had become excluded from eligibility for the throne. The Free Oyo held several titles, with succession chosen by their lineages. The most important were the 7 members of the Oyo Mesi. In order of rank, they were the Basorun, the most important of the Oyo Mesi and most powerful chief of the Free Oyo after the Alafin. He served as regent during the waiting period between the death of one Alafin and the succession of another. He divined at the annual Orun festival, determining if the Alafin's sacrifice had been accepted by the gods. He was also the commander-in-chief of the army of the Oyo capital. The Agbakin, in charge of the cult of Oranmiyan, the founder of Oyo. The Alapini, in charge of the Egungun cult, the masquerades who represented the spirits of the deceased. The Loguna, in charge of the Orisa Oko cult, the god of farming. The Asipa, in charge of the cult of Ogun, the god of war, iron, and hunting. The Samu, one of the Abobaku. The Akiniku, the 7th member of the Oyo Mesi. Other titles included the Eso, the 70 war chiefs, 16 senior and 54 junior, who acted as subordinate commanders of the army under the Oyo Mesi. This title was not hereditary, but by merit. The Eso were appointed by the Oyo Mesi, but approved by the Alafin. They occupied a special quarter of the city known as Oke Eso. Another title was the Parakoi, who were in charge of the Muslims in the empire and led the Oyo Muslims in war. The Oyo Empire was a traditionalist Yoruba state until the reign of Alafin Ajagbo, though there's no recorded history of any Alafin of Oyo Ile adopting Islam. The Alafin appointed the Imam, who in turn offered prayers for the Alafin. Beyond the capital, Oyo controlled its empire through vassals, tributes, and strategic governance. The Alafin used subordinate rulers to govern tributary states that were not fully incorporated into the Oyo kingdom. These subordinate rulers weren't allowed to wear crowns with beaded fringes called ade, but wore beadless crowns known as akoro. The more important tributary states had rulers called oba, who wore crowns, while lesser tributary rulers were called bale and were crownless. The beaded crown, the ade, was only worn by the Alafin. Every town under Oyo rule was required to provide adequate military service to the Oyo army. The central government had absolute authority over foreign policy. The Alafin had final say on succession of chiefs and power to depose them. He was the final judge in the realm. Capital cases, emasculation, and death penalty all required his decision. The central government also gave religious sanctions. The Oyo kingdom proper, not including tributary states, consisted of 8 provinces: Ikun Osi, with its chief town in Ikoyi; Ikun Ibolo, with its chief town in Iresa; Ikun Epo, with its chief town in Idode; Ikun Otun, with its chief town in Saki; Ikun Onko, with its chief town in Igana; Ikun Ibarapa, with its chief towns in Erua and Igbo-Ora; Ikun Igbomina, with its chief town in Ajase Ipo; Ikun Egbado, with its chief town in Ilaro. The Ikun heads were responsible for their provinces, and every chief answered to the Ikun head first before going to the Alafin. Ikun heads were also required to raise armies from their provinces during wartime. The Ikun heads weren't all equal in status. The most respected and leader of the Ikuns was the Onikoyi of Ikoyi, who led the other chiefs during the Bere festival. Next in rank was the Okere of Saki.
Every Ikun head had patrons called Baba in the capital. These Babas communicated directly with the crown on behalf of the Ikun heads, since the Ikun heads couldn't rule their provinces from the Okiafi, but from their respective territories. In some cases, these Babas represented the Ikun heads at the Bere festival, submitting tributes on their behalf to the Alafin. For proper supervision, Asojuoba, those who serve as the king's eye, also known as Ajele, were installed in each Ikun. These Ajele were normally appointed by the Alafin from among the palace slaves. When the Alafin died, the burial often involved the killing of some slaves, some of his wives, and even some chiefs known as Abobaku. These killings provided the Alafin with attendants in the afterlife.
The Oyo army comprised 3 divisions: the Elesing, or the cavalry, the Olofa, or the archers, and the Elese, or the foot soldiers. The cavalry and archers were the most important divisions, while the foot soldiers made up the bulk of the army, comprising both trained warriors and non-specialist, able-bodied Oyo men who could be conscripted if needed. The horses used in the cavalry were imported from Bornu and Nupe, as horses bred in Oyo weren't as strong, and also due to the outbreak of African sleeping sickness. Horses were very expensive, sold at double the price of slaves. The normal weapon of the Oyo cavalry was the spear, either the lance, called the oko, or the javelin, known as the asin. Muskets were bought by the Oyo Empire, but failure to understand how to use them led to their abandonment, with Oyo relying on their ever-reliable spears. During long and far-away military campaigns, the Olokun Asin and the stable slaves followed the army to gather fodder for the horses and care for them. The archers usually fought on foot. Mounted archers were very rare, as this was uncommon in West Africa at the time. The war chiefs of the capital were the Eso, divided into 16 senior war chiefs and 54 junior war chiefs, totaling 70. They were the leading generals of the capital's army, and during any campaign, only 35 were sent out, while the remaining 35 stayed to protect the country. The Essos brought their highly trained troops whenever needed. They came under the authority of the Oyo Mesi. In earlier times, the Alafins usually led the army to battle, but this stopped after the deaths of Alafin Oluodo and Ajiboyede during the course of battle. After this, the Basoruns was tasked to lead the army. The army also had a provincial contingent containing all provincial troops under the immediate command of their bales and obas. The chiefs of the provinces, the Ekun chiefs, such as the Onikoyi of Ikoyi in Ekun Osi, Okere of Saki in Ekun Otun, Sabigana of Igana in Ekun Onko, and others, all commanded troops under their own Ekun, but all Ekun chiefs answered to the Onikoyi of Ikoyi. During the imperial period, a new war title was created, the Are-Ona-Kakanfo, Chief of the Ona-Kakanfo, or Chief of the Chiefs of Kakanfo. This position was introduced by Alafin Ajagbo. The Are-Ona-Kakanfo lived in one of the provinces and was the ruler of a semi-independent palatinate in a frontier area where enemy pressure was especially great. He was the commander-in-chief of the provincial army, meaning all Ekun chiefs answered to him. However, the Ekun chiefs had the right to excuse themselves from campaigns led by the Are-Ona-Kakanfo. The Are-Ona-Kakanfo was chosen by merit, not heredity. He must have previously been an Ekun chief or held the junior title of Baal. During his installation, his head was shaved and incisions were made in which charms were inserted, just like the Ilaris. This secured his allegiance to the Alafin. Under the Are-Ona-Kakanfo were two subordinate chiefs, the Otun-Kakanfo and the Osi-Kakanfo, leaders of the right and left wings in battle, with the Otun-Kakanfo being higher in rank. And here was the law. If the Are-Ona-Kakanfo couldn't win a campaign within 3 months, he was required to commit suicide. The exact size of the army isn't known, but it's believed that the army that raided Alada with the Huids' assistance numbered 100,000 spears. However, by the defeat of the Oyo Empire by the Dahomeyan army in 1823, the army had dwindled to a mere 4,000 spears. At the very top of the Yoruba spiritual cosmos stood Olodumare, also known as Olorun, the owner of heaven. Olodumare was the supreme deity, the creator of all things, the source of all existence, the beginning and the end. But here's what makes Yoruba religion fascinating. Olodumare was so supreme, so transcendent, that direct worship of him was rare. Think about it. How do you worship infinity? How do you pray to the very essence of existence itself? Instead, the Yoruba understood that Olodumare worked through intermediaries, through divine messengers, through forces of nature and aspects of existence that humans could comprehend and relate to. These divine intermediaries were called the Orisa. The Orisa weren't just gods. They were forces. They were archetypes. They were the thunder and the storm, the strength in the warrior's arm, the wisdom in the elder's words, the fertility in the farmer's soil. There were hundreds of Orisa, perhaps thousands, depending on the region and the lineage, but certain Orisa held special importance in the Oyo Empire. Sango, the god of thunder. The most important Orisa in Oyo was Sango, the god of thunder, lightning, fire, and justice. But Sango wasn't just any god. According to Oyo tradition, Sango had once been a man, a king, the fourth Alafin of Oyo, who ruled with such power and majesty that after his death he ascended to become a god. Sango was fierce. Sango was passionate. Sango was justice personified. When lightning struck, it was Sango's anger. When thunder rolled across the savannah, it was Sango's voice. The priests of Sango could predict where lightning would strike, and when they found the thunderstones, the stone axes that fell with lightning, they were collected as sacred objects. The Alafin himself was seen as the reincarnation of Sango, the living embodiment of the thunder god on earth. This wasn't metaphor, this was literal belief. When the Alafin spoke, Sango spoke. When the Alafin judged, Sango judged. The Alafin controlled the Sango cult, and the Otun Iwefa, one of the 3 chief eunuchs of the palace, had charge of the Sango cult, supervising the principal Sango shrine in the suburban hamlet of Koso. Ogun, the god of war, iron, and hunting. In an empire built on cavalry charges and iron spears, Ogun was essential. He was the god of war, but more than that, he was the god of iron, of technology, of every blade forged, every spear sharpened, every hoe that broke the earth. Ogun was the patron of warriors, blacksmiths, and hunters. Before battle, warriors would make sacrifices to Ogun. Before forging a weapon, blacksmiths would invoke his name. The Asipa, one of the 7 members of the Oyo Mesi, was in charge of the cult of Ogun. To worship Ogun was to worship strength, innovation, and the ability to shape the world through human hands and divine will. Obatala, the god of creation. Obatala was the creator deity, the sculptor of human bodies, the god of wisdom, purity, and moral righteousness. In Yoruba cosmology, Obatala molded human forms from clay before Olodumare breathed life into them. Obatala was associated with white cloth, white beads, and purity. His followers wore white and abstained from palm wine, as legend says Obatala once drank palm wine and made mistakes while creating humans, creating those with disabilities and deformities. Out of remorse, Obatala became the protector of people with disabilities. Orunmila, the god of wisdom and destiny. Orunmila, also called Ifa, was the god of wisdom, divination, and destiny. He was present when each person's destiny was chosen before birth. He knew the past, present, and future. He was the keeper of all knowledge. Through Orunmila came Ifa divination, one of the most sophisticated divination systems in human history. Orisa Oko, the god of farming. In an empire whose wealth was built on agriculture, Orisa Oko was crucial. He was the god of farming, of fertile soil, of abundant harvest. The Loguna, one of the 7 members of the Oyo Mesi, was in charge of the Orisa Oko cult. Before planting season, farmers would make sacrifices to Orisa Oko. The fertility of the land, the success of the harvest, these weren't just natural processes, they were divine gifts. Oranmiyan, the deified founder. Oranmiyan, or Oranmiyan, the legendary founder of Oyo, was also venerated as an Orisa. The Agbakin, one of the 7 members of the Oyo Mesi, was in charge of the cult of Oranmiyan. This cult maintained the connection between the living empire and its mythical origins, between the present Alafin and the first king who followed the serpent to Oyo Ile. If the Orisa were the gods, then Ifa was the language through which they spoke to humanity. Ifa divination was the sacred technology of communication between the human and divine worlds. The system was staggeringly complex. It involved 256 distinct patterns called Odu, each associated with specific poems, proverbs, stories, and prescriptions. A properly trained Ifa priest, called a Babalawo, meaning father of secrets, could spend a lifetime studying and still not master every verse, every story, every interpretation. When someone faced a problem, sickness, infertility, bad luck, uncertainty about the future, they would consult a Babalawo. The priest would use either palm nuts or a divining chain called opele to cast patterns. The pattern that emerged would correspond to one of the 256 Odu. Each Odu contained multiple verses, poems, and stories passed down orally through generations. The Babalawo would recite these verses until the client recognized their situation in one of the stories. Then the Babalawo would prescribe sacrifices, specific offerings to specific Orisa to restore balance and harmony. This wasn't fortune-telling in the cheap sense. This was a sophisticated system of psychological counseling, community wisdom, herbal medicine, and spiritual guidance, all wrapped into one. Ifa wasn't fatalistic. Yes, it acknowledged that each person had a destiny chosen before birth, but it also taught that through proper sacrifice, proper behavior, and proper alignment with the Orisa, one could navigate that destiny successfully. The Yoruba don't believe in blind fate. They believe in destiny that can be negotiated, influenced, improved, and Ifa divination was the tool for that negotiation. The Alafin himself consulted Ifa. The annual Mole festival was held in honor of Ifa, the god of divination, and was one of only 3 times a year when the Alafin left the Okeafin to appear before his people.
The Alafin wasn't just a political leader. He was the spiritual and religious father figure of the empire. He held the title Ikeji Orisa, Companion of the Gods, a title that placed him between the human and divine worlds. Think about what this meant. Every judicial decision the Alafin made wasn't just law, it was divine justice channeled through Sango. Every blessing he gave wasn't just words, it was the power of the Orisa flowing through him. The Alafin controlled the Sango cult. He oversaw religious sanctions across the empire. He determined which festivals would be held and when. The 3 annual festivals where he appeared publicly, the Mole Festival for Ifa, the Orun Festival for divine approval of his reign, and the Bere Festival for receiving tributes, these weren't just political ceremonies, they were sacred rites that maintained the cosmic order. At the annual Orun Festival, something remarkable happened. The Alafin, the living god-king, would make sacrifices and then wait while the Basorun performed divination to determine if the gods approved of his continued reign over the people. Think about that. Even the divine king had to ask permission from the gods to continue ruling. Even the reincarnation of Sango had to prove himself worthy. This was the Yoruba understanding of power. Even supreme power had to be accountable to something higher. If the gods rejected the Alafin's sacrifice, the implications were clear. His reign was no longer blessed, and a king without divine blessing couldn't rule. The Alafin was only seen outside the Okeafin 3 times a year. The rest of the time, he remained in the palace, a sacred space, a threshold between worlds. This wasn't imprisonment. This was the necessary condition of his divine status. Too much contact with the ordinary world would diminish his sacred power. He had to remain partially removed, partially mysterious, partially divine. His slaves, the Eru Oba, performed his earthly tasks. His eunuchs, the Iwefa, mediated between him and the chiefs. His messengers, the Ilari, carried his words to the outside world. The Alafin dwelt in the liminal space between heaven and earth, and from that space he maintained the spiritual order of the empire.
In Yoruba religion, death isn't the end. The dead become ancestors, Egun, and ancestors remain active in the lives of the living. They watch over their descendants. They offer guidance. They can bless or curse. They must be remembered, honored, and fed. The Egungun were the masquerades who represented the spirits of the deceased. The Alapini one of the 7 members of the Oyo Mesi, was in charge of the Egungun cult. During Egungun festivals, masked dancers would appear, completely covered in elaborate costumes and wooden masks. These weren't mere performers. These were the ancestors themselves, temporarily returned to the world of the living, embodied in the dancers. No one could touch an Egungun. To do so would be to violate the boundary between life and death, a dangerous, potentially fatal transgression. The voice of the Egungun was distorted, otherworldly, because it wasn't a human voice, it was the voice of the dead. The Egungun would bless the community, settle disputes, offer counsel, and then return to the spirit world. Through this practice, the past remained present, the dead remained alive. The lineage, the idile, extended backward through time to the founding ancestors and forward into the unborn future.
Sacrifice, Ebu, was central to Yoruba religion. But this wasn't primitive superstition. This was sophisticated theology. The Yoruba understood the universe as a system of exchange, of reciprocity, of balance. The Orisa gave blessings, health, wealth, children, victory in war. Humans gave offerings in return, food, animals, cowries, palm wine, cola nuts. This wasn't bribery, this was relationship. This was maintaining the cosmic order. Just as you would offer gifts to a king or feed a guest in your home, so too must you offer to the Orisa. Different Orisa required different sacrifices. Sango preferred rams, red oil, bitter cola. Ogun required dogs, roosters, palm wine. Obatala required white pigeons, white cloth, cocoa butter. The specificity mattered. To give the wrong offering was like speaking the wrong language. The message wouldn't get through. Animal sacrifice was common, particularly of roosters, goats, rams, and in important cases, cattle. The Yoruba understood that life force, ase, resided in blood. To offer blood was to offer life itself, the most precious thing. When an animal was sacrificed, portions would be offered to the Orisa. Portions would be consumed by the priests, and portions would be shared with the community. Nothing was wasted. The sacrifice nourished both the spiritual and physical worlds. Human sacrifice, though rare, did occur in the most extreme circumstances. When the Alafin died, some of his slaves, some of his wives, and certain chiefs called Abobaku were required to commit ritual suicide to accompany him to the afterlife. This wasn't murder, it was sacred duty, ensuring that the dead king would not arrive in the spirit world alone and unprepared. We can be uncomfortable with this practice today, but we must understand it in its context, a worldview where death wasn't the end, where the afterlife was real, where serving one's king beyond death was the highest honor.
The Oyo Empire was a traditionalist Yoruba state for most of its history. The Orisa, Ifa, the ancestors, these were the spiritual foundation. But in the 19th century, Islam began to make significant inroads into the empire. Islam had been present in Yoruba land for centuries through trade contacts with the north, through Hausa merchants, through Fulani pastoralists. But it was in the 19th century that it began to convert significant numbers of Oyo people. By this time, there were Parakoyi, chiefs in charge of the Muslims in the empire, who led the Oyo Muslims in war. The Alafin appointed the Imam, who in turn offered prayers for the Alafin. This showed a pragmatic tolerance. The traditional Yoruba religion didn't claim to be the only truth. Other paths to the divine could coexist. But this tolerance had limits, and the limits were tested dramatically in 1817 when Afonya, the Are-Ona-Kakanfo, invited Muslim preachers to Ilorin to support his rebellion against the Alafin. Malams like Salih and Muhammad Gumso went around preaching jihad and selling charms.
The Alafin ordered their execution, but due to widespread support for Islam, some escaped. When Salih declared jihad against Oyo in Ilorin, the Muslim rebellion attracted Fulani pastoralists, northern slaves, and Oyo Muslims, led by a chief of Kuo called Solageru. The traditional Yoruba religious order was directly challenged by the Islamic call to monotheism and holy war. The Muslim rebellion contributed directly to the fall of the Oyo Empire. When the jihadists took control of Ilorin in 1823, after killing Afonia, they established an emirate loyal to the Sokoto Caliphate. Ilorin, once a Yoruba province of Oyo, became a Muslim state. The Orisa were replaced by Allah. The Babalawo were replaced by the Imam. The drums of Sango fell silent. Yet even as Islam gained ground, traditional Yoruba religion persisted. Many people practiced both, consulting Ifa divination while also praying to Allah, making sacrifices to the Orisa while also attending mosque. This religious syncretism wasn't seen as contradiction, but as pragmatism. Why rely on one source of spiritual power when you could access multiple? The Yoruba have always been religiously flexible. If a new god or practice proved effective, it could be adopted. If an old one still worked, it would be maintained. Religion was about results, protection, prosperity, health, success, not about exclusive truth claims.
During the later years of the Oyo Empire's reign, Christianity arrived, brought by European missionaries and returning freed slaves from Sierra Leone and Brazil who had been converted abroad. Christianity brought a different message than Islam. Where Islam could accommodate some Yoruba practices, many Muslim Yoruba still consulted Ifa. Christianity was more exclusionary. The missionaries taught that the Orisa were demons, that Ifa was witchcraft, that sacrifice was barbaric. Yet even Christianity couldn't completely erase the traditional religion. Instead, what emerged was another form of syncretism. In the diaspora, in Brazil, Cuba, Haiti, enslaved Yoruba people hid their Orisa behind Catholic saints. Sango became Saint Jerome. Ogun became Saint Peter. Obatala became Our Lady of Mercy. The forms changed, the names changed, but the essence, the relationship with the divine forces, the practice of divination, the offering of sacrifice, the honoring of ancestors, these endured. The story of Oyo and Dahomey is one of the great military sagas of African history. In 1698, some subjects of the King of Alada were dissatisfied with their ruler's tyranny and ran to the Alafin of Oyo for intervention. The Alafin sent emissaries to the Alada kingdom to relay his message to the king. The King of Alada's response? He killed the Oyo emissary. This angered the Alafin, prompting him to send a large cavalry. With help and assistance from the Hueda kingdom, also called Waida, Oyo forces overran the Alada kingdom. Some have argued it was just a punitive raid. There were no more records of Oyo involvement in the Aja country until 1726. In 1726, the Dahomeyan army, led by King Agaja, attacked Alada and ousted King Kasa. King Kasa sought help from the Alafin of Oyo, and the Alafin sent his forces to attack Dahomey and Agaja. Oyo's forces ruthlessly destroyed the Dahomeyan force. Agaja retreated into the bush country, and it wasn't until 1727, after Oyo left Abomey, that he reoccupied the city and killed King Kasa. Agaja, fearing another Oyo invasion, signed a peace treaty with Oyo, retaining dominion of the Alada realm in addition to the Dahomey kingdom. But the peace didn't last. In February 1727, Dahomey attacked Hueda, and King Huffin cried to the Oyos, reminding them that Hueda had helped them defeat Alada in 1698. Heeding Hufin's cry and fearing the rise of Agaja, Oyo attacked Dahomey in March 1728. Agaja declined to fight. After ransacking Abomi, the Oyo army returned home, and Agaja reoccupied Dahomey. In January 1730, Oyo invaded Dahomey again, the third time. Agaja again declined to fight and escaped across the river to Mono, a tributary of the Kufo, northwest of Abomi. Oyo occupied Abomi until July before returning home. Once more, Agaja reoccupied Dahomey. In January 1730, Oyo invaded Dahomey again, the fourth time. Agaja, growing tired of constant fights with Oyo, wanted to make peace. With an offering of 600 slaves, the army of Oyo was removed from Abomi. King Agaja dispatched ambassadors and one of his daughters to be married to the Alafin. The Alafin reciprocated, sending one of his daughters to Agaja. Hostages were exchanged, including Avisu, the son of Agaja. Dahomey was allowed to carry on with their conquests, but must pay tributes to Oyo. There were a few skirmishes. In 1731, there was a battle between Dahomey and Mehi, in which Oyo supported Mehi due to their filial relationship.
In 1739, the Oyo army invaded Dahomey again, the fifth time, sacking Abomi, Kana, and Zanza. However, the Oyo commander failed to capture Agaja and was disgraced instead of celebrated. This 1739 attack was a response to a 1737 Dahomeyan raid east of the river Weme against Badagari. After King Agaja's death in 1740, Dahomey was invaded twice more, in 1742 and 1748, during the reign of King Avisu, Agaja's son. The 1748 invasion was a response to the 1747 invasion of Epe by King Avisu. It was after the 1748 invasion that Dahomey finally pledged to be a tributary state to Oyo. For the next 75 years, until 1823, Dahomey paid annual tribute to Oyo. This tribute was presented every November at Kana by the Agbangan and included 41 men, 41 women, 41 muskets, 41 barrels of gunpowder, 41 bales, each containing 41 pieces of cloth, 41 baskets, each containing 41 strings of beads or corals, 41 rams, 41 goats, 41 cocks, 41 hens, and 400 loads of cowries, equaling 8 million cowries, approximately $4,000 in present-day dollars. Think about that. For 75 years, one of West Africa's most fearsome kingdoms paid tribute to Oyo every single year. Under Alafin Abiodun, between 1774 and 1789, the Egun states of Porto Novo and the Mahi were also made tributary states to Oyo through a series of conquests.
Agriculture, especially foodstuff farming, was the main source of the economy. In the northern savanna areas of the Oyo Kingdom, the main crops were cereals like millet and maize. In the southern forest areas, the main crops were roots like yams and cassava. Tree crops like oil palm, kola nut, pepper, and plantains were also cultivated in the south. Bush fallowing was the chief agricultural practice. Hoes were the chief tool, and there were no plows. Investment in the land rested on the idale, the lineage, while cultivation could be done by individual families or groups of families who came together to farm, called aro. Sheep and goats were reared, but due to the infestation of tsetse flies, cattle weren't reared. Further into the northern areas were immigrant Fulani pastoralists who reared cattle and traded their products with the Oyos. There were also Oyo cattle tended by slaves of northern origin
especially Hausa. The Oyos were experts in iron smelting, pottery, and the manufacture of cotton cloths. Oyo Ile was known for pottery and cotton cloth production. Ijana of Egbado province had a reputation for cotton cloth production. The clothes woven used the men's pattern of weaving on upright looms, producing narrow strips of cloth 6 inches. Ila was known for producing broadcloth using the women's pattern 18 inches. There was also a silk industry which employed the color indigo for production. The pottery, iron, cotton, and indigo were cultivated locally, while silk was imported from the north. In some cases, iron was also imported from Europe, along with rum, gunpowder, woolen clothes, and copper. Jasper bead crafts were produced in Oyo Ile, with beads imported from Upper Volta. Leatherworks were also produced in Oyo Ile. The craftsmen were obligated to join craft guilds called Egbe. These guilds regulated standards, prices, and discussed craft-related issues. The currency in the Oyo Empire was the cavalry, imported from the Maldives Island in the Indian Ocean from as early as the 11th century. There were 2 systems of cavalry enumeration, one based on a string of 40 cowries and a head of 50 strings, 2,000 cowries, derived from the coast. The second based on units of 20, 200, 2,000 cowries from Hausaland and Kong, also used in Mande, northwest of Asante. Cowries were used for petty trades, while high-volume trades were carried out using barter. Transportation by mounted wagons wasn't common due to African sleeping sickness, so goods were carried long distances by human porters or slaves. In the north of the Oyo Empire, the Nupe traded with Oyos through the town of Ogudu before the trading center was moved to Saguda after Ogudu was destroyed in a Nupe civil war and the capital of the Nupe province was moved to Tsaragi. Saguda was also called Raka by the Hausas. Trade between Oyo and Bariba was done in the town of Busa. In the early 19th century, the Nupe, Bariba, and Oyo started trading together in the town of Kulfo. From the Nupe, Oyo imported hides, horses, saddles, and cotton cloth. From Bornu, the Oyos imported natron, or sodium sescarbonate, a mineral salt used for medicinal purposes and mixed with tobacco or snuff as a stimulant. From Benin, Oyo imported camwood. From across the Sahara, the Oyos imported unwrought stock and beads of Venetian manufacture. The Oyo, in turn, exported excess goods down to the coast. Oyo also exported pepper, tamarind, jasper beads, kola nuts, and locally made clothes. Oyo also traded horses with Benin, as the horses imported from Oyo were used for ceremonial purposes by the kings and chiefs of Benin.
During the reign of Alafin Obalokun, Oyo is believed to have established trade with the Europeans first. It was during his reign that Oyo imported ground salt called Iyo. This doesn't mean there was no salt in the Oyo kingdom. There was rock salt called Obu. Oyo participated in the transatlantic slave trade. They traded large volumes of slaves from 1640 with the Europeans through the ports of Ofra and Jakin of the Kingdom of Alada and through the Grehwe port of the Kingdom of Hueda. This trade was relatively uninterrupted until 1717 when the kings of Hueda and Alada tried to tighten royal control of the slave trade. The king of Alada tried to reserve the purchase of firearms and cowries to himself, while the king of Hueda appointed a royal agent to whom slaves brought by hinterland traders had to be sold. This greatly affected the hinterland traders. This prompted Agaja, king of Dahomey, to conquer Alada in 1724 and Hueda in 1727, securing their ports. Agaja also tried to monopolize the slave trade. Dahomey, being a tributary state to Oyo by 1730, was obligated to give access to Oyo slave traders. This continued until 1732, when the Jakin port was destroyed by the Dahomeyans. After Agaja's death, Kwengla was crowned king of Dahomey, and also attempted to monopolize the slave trade. He wasn't deterred by the attacks Oyo had made on Agaja. Kwengla tried to establish a royal monopoly, compelling inland traders to sell their slaves to his agents at fixed prices. This forced Oyo further east to trade in the ports of Epe, Apa, Badagry, Lagos, and Porto Novo. These new ports made the Kingdom of Weme even more important as a staging post on the trade route. Kwengla tried to remedy this by eliminating his rivals in the east militarily. When Alafin Abiodun heard of this, he quickly stepped in. In 1777, he extended protection to Porto Novo and Badagry. Alafin wasn't ready to stay idle while Kwengla crippled the eastern ports, as he could trade slaves through these ports without hassle. In 1781, war broke out between Badagry and Porto Novo. Alafin Abiodun refused to intervene but planned to concentrate on his trade in Porto Novo, so he called for Kwengla. Kwengla thought that Abiodun planned to return to trading slaves at Hueda, but he was outmaneuvered. With the forces of Porto Novo and encouragement from Oyo, Kwengla destroyed Epe in 1782, Badagry in 1784, and Weme in 1786. But instead of the slave trade being transferred to Hueda, Kwengla was met with silence from Porto Novo. Even Dahomeyan traders were prohibited from entering Porto Novo. The bulk of slaves traded by the Oyos were mainly war captives, especially from their northern and western neighbors, and enslaved criminals. Slaves purchased from neighbors were also sold. The slave trade hit its peak in the 1780s, but after the outbreak of the European War in 1793 and the temporary abolition of the slave trade by France between 1794 and 1802, the trade declined. During this time, the center of the European slave trade moved from Porto Novo to Lagos, causing Oyo traders to also move their activities to Lagos. In addition to slaves, Oyo traded clothes, ivory, and palm oil, though in smaller quantities with Europeans. In return, the Oyos got salt, cloth, earthenware, beads, rum, tobacco, firearms, cowrie shells, and iron bars. Taxes were a prevalent source of income for the Alafin. Those who came to trade in the capital were taxed at the gate and also at the market. These taxes were collected in cash, not in kind, except for the tax on local farmers who brought crops into the city, which was paid in kind and appropriated for the maintenance of gatekeepers. Market dues were collected by the Osi-Iwefa, while gate taxes were collected by the Ilari. The Alafin depended on his massive number of slaves to cultivate large portions of land and produce large quantities of food for his very large palace entourage. The female slaves of the Alafin participated in petty trades across the empire, while male slaves were custodians of the slave trade for the Alafin. All income gained from these activities was presented to the Alafin. The taxes imposed on every trader in the markets weren't imposed on the Alafin's female slaves. Their goods were wrapped in special cloths to distinguish them from others, and trying to replicate this cloth would result in punishment by enslavement. Slaves were also a very important instrument in the economy. They could be sold and employed as free and cheap labor to produce farm products, as well as cotton, iron, and silks.
Under Alafin Abiodun, the Oyo Empire experienced its peak. But it was also under Abiodun that the empire started to weaken. Towards the end of his reign in 1783, Oyo suffered a crushing defeat in an attack on the Bariba kingdom of Kayama. As a result, Oyo started paying tributes to Nupe, a humiliation that would have been unthinkable decades earlier. In 1790, under Alafin Owole, Oyo attempted to halt the payment of tribute to Nupe, but was decisively defeated in a war waged against Nupe. It was under Alafin Owole that the Oyo Empire collapsed. The collapse began at the center, following a series of unfortunate events. It began when Abiodun's son, the Aremo Adesina, was rejected by the Oyo Mesi. Owole was crowned Alafin because the Oyo Mesi saw him as someone who could easily be controlled. But they were wrong. Owole was majorly influenced by his personal advisors,
his kinsmen, and his eunuchs. He disregarded the Oyo Mesi. He quarreled with Basoruns Asamu and Owota-Lafiano, one of the 70 Esos. But his greatest undoing was quarreling with the Are-Ona-Kakanfo, Afonja, who was the provincial ruler of Ilorin. Afonja had very clear relations with the royal lineage and culminated the plan of becoming the Alafin. Owole held grievances against Afonja because Afonja had punished him for a misdemeanor during the reign of Alafin Abiodun. Owole, persuaded by his chiefs, tried to destroy Afonja. He ordered him to attack the well-fortified city of Iwere in the Onko province. But here's the catch. Iwere was the town of Alafin Abiodun's mother. Afonja reminded the war chiefs that they owed their titles and lives to Abiodun. This was enough to turn the war chiefs' heads. Instead of besieging Iwere, the Onikoyi of Ikoyi, Basoruns Asamu, and Owota-Lafiano marched into Oyoile and overthrew Owole in 1796. Afonja thought the Oyo Mesi would choose him as the next Alafin. But the Oyo Mesi, who wanted to maintain control of the empire, wouldn't choose such a strong man as Afonja as Alafin. They picked a prince called Adebo instead. Afonja wasn't going to accept this. He allied with the Ilupo of Ajase-Ipo, who was the principal ruler of the Igbomina province. They began laying claim to the Igbomina province, removing the Alafins Ajile and installing their own. Afonja also set up an alliance with Opele, the Bail of Bogun, who had been pivotal in the mutiny against Owole. They began attacking neighboring towns. Opele was killed while laying siege on Igboho, but before his death, he took Idofian and Igbohu. Then Ojo Agumbambarum appeared, the son of Basorun Gaha, who had escaped the killings of Basorun Gaha's kinsmen and taken refuge in Bariba. He came to Oyo with a force of Bariba archers and massacred all the chiefs who were friends with Afonja and all chiefs who had a hand in killing his father. Ojo called the remaining chiefs he thought loyal to him, and they went to besiege Iloni, but he was betrayed by Adegun, the Onikoyi of Ikuyi. He was defeated and went back into hiding with the Baribas. Adebo, meanwhile, tried to deal with the factions and sent warriors to Ilori, but before the warriors could reach Ilori, he died. The Oyo Mesi then chose Maku, a very good ally of Afonja, as the Alafin in a bid to appease Afonja. But Afonja again refused to acknowledge Maku's authority. Maku was removed by the Oyo Mesi when he lost the battle at Iworo after deciding to lead the army himself. Maku and Adebo ruled for 120 days and 3 months, respectively. After Maku's death, Oyo was ruled by the Basorun Ojo Aburuma, grandson of Basorun Gaha. He ruled as regent for 5 years until 1802, when a new Alafin, Majotu, was installed. The new Alafin tried to reassert Oyo power in Porto-Novo and the Mahi country.
In 1817, Afonja saw an opportunity to take the throne from Alafin Majotu. He incited a Muslim rebellion, planning to harness the jihad movement of Usman Dan Fodio that started in 1804 and was spreading fast in the region. Afonja saw the large number of Fulanis in the northern part of the Oyo Empire and the indifferent Muslims in other parts who would answer and support the call of jihad by Usman Dan Fodio. There were also large numbers of slaves of northern origins who were Muslims. A confrontation with the indigenous authorities by Muslim Fulani leaders would appeal to them as liberation. At this time, several Malams such as Saleh and Muhammad Gumso went around preaching about jihad and selling charms in the empire. The Alafin ordered the execution of these Malams, but due to widespread love for Islam, some were assisted in escaping. Afonja, who himself was not a Muslim, invited Saleh to Ilorin because of his personal ambitions. Here, Saleh declared jihad against Oyo. This was met by wide support from both Oyo Muslims and Fulani pastoralists, and there was a widespread revolt of the northern slaves. The Oyo Muslims were led by a chief of Kuo called Solageru. During the course of these rebellions, Saleh was killed and his son, Abdusalami, subsequently became the ruler of the Ilorin Muslims. Afonja clearly miscalculated. The Muslim rebellion turned into a rampage he never expected. It went as far as some parts of the capital getting burnt before they were finally repelled. Afonja, seeing this, tried to salvage the situation. He wanted to rule over the living, not the dead. He asked the jihadists to move east and settle, but he was greeted with an insurrection in which he was killed in 1823. Abdusalami now became the ruler of Ilorin and declared allegiance to the Sokoto Caliphate. He was formally recognized by the Caliphate as the Emir of Yoruba and placed under the Emir of Gwandu, who was responsible for the western emirates of the Sokoto Caliphate. Total destruction of Yoruba power in Ilorin was achieved by the liquidation of the Yoruba Muslim leader Solageru. Some of Afonja's followers left Ilorin, while the rest remained but were now subject to Fulani rule. After the Muslim jihadists conquered Ilorin, Oyo tried one last time to recover Ilorin under Alafin Majotu. They mustered a force and went to attack Ilorin, but were defeated at the Battle of Ogele. Another force was mustered with assistance from Etsu Mayiya II of the Nupe kingdom. They besieged Ilorin but were defeated in the Mugmang-Mugba War. Oyo, seeing that they couldn't reclaim Ilorin, ended up seeing Ilorin as an ally and abandoned every plan of reclaiming it. Oyo was thrown into disarray, and the different city-states in the empire were all drawn into war with each other for control, bringing about the effective destruction of the once illustrious Oyo Empire. Tributary states, seeing the civil unrest happening in Oyo, took this opportunity to liberate themselves. Egbaland was the first to revolt. The revolt was led by Lisabi, a war chief of Igbane in the Alake province of Egbaland. The revolt started when over 600 of the Alafins representatives who were sent to Egbaland to collect tribute were killed. Oyo sent an expedition to invade Egbaland and bring it to its knees, but this expedition was defeated. Lisabi was later killed when he was fighting against the Dahomeyans, and the Egba Confederacy dispersed and never really materialized. Dahomey also revolted after the Muslim rebellion in 1823 under King Gezo. Just as Oyo representatives who came to collect tribute from Egbaland were killed by Lisabi, the same fate was meted out to them by Gezo. He killed 12 Oyo messengers in Kana who came to collect tribute. Oyo responded by sending troops to subdue Gezo, but Gezo defeated and repulsed the Oyo force at Pawinyan in the Mahi country. A second and larger force was sent out under the command of Ajanaku, but the force was defeated at Kpaloko in the Mahi country. The Oyo force dispersed and fled in retreat across the Weme River. Ajanaku was taken as a prisoner and executed, and Kpaloko was taken by the Dahomeyans. This defeat suffered by Oyo at the hands of the Dahomeyans was not only humiliating, but also ended the influence of Oyo over its tributaries in the west. Badagry also broke out of Oyo control in the 1830s under Adele, the exiled king of Lagos. He went to war against the subjects of Oyo in Egbado.
In the south, the kingdoms also saw this as an opportunity to break off from Oyo's influence. The kingdom of Owu, which was the main ally of Oyo in the region, was tagged for destruction by these kingdoms. The decline of the Oyo Empire really affected the slave trade in the region badly, causing even more havoc and unrest. Due to a lack of slave supply from Oyo to Ijebu, the Ijebu started raiding the Opomu area of the towns of the western Ife kingdom. Due to this and the social unrest in Oyo, Adegun, the Onikoyi of Ikoyi, and Toyeje, the Baal of Ogbomoso, sent word to Akijobi, the Olu of Owu, to help suppress the raids. Olu Akijobi complied and attacked and subjected several towns, including Opomu. This action provoked war with the Ife kingdom in 1812, but Owu came out victorious. A few years later, in 1817,
Ijebu formed an alliance with Ife and attacked Owu. Due to Ijebu's involvement in the slave trade, they were well equipped with European muskets. The involvement of Ijebu tipped the war against Owu, and Owu was defeated. Owu was besieged. Oyo, on the other hand, couldn't assist Owu due to the Muslim rebellion. The refugees and adventurers displaced by the Muslim rebellion joined in besieging Owu, and in 1822, Owu fell. The forces of Ife, Ijebu, and the Oyo refugees proceeded to invade Egbaland and successfully displaced them. The people of Egbaland rallied and established a new city at Abeokuta along the river Ogun. The Oyo refugees occupied the towns of Ota and Ijaye in the Bagura province of Egbaland. Meanwhile, in Egbado, Dekun, who was the Ilari placed in charge of Egbado, took advantage of the situation in Oyo and made himself lord in Egbado. After the destruction of Egbaland, Dekun and Asede, the Balogan of Ijana, took their followers out of Ijana and founded Refu-Refu. But after a disagreement between Dekun and Asede, Dekun was exiled from Refu-Refu and went to Dahomey, imploring Gezo to attack Refu-Refu. Gezo obliged and conquered Refu-Refu, destroying Oyo power in Egbado. In 1833, the Egba of Abeokuta invaded Egbado again, destroying Ilaro and Ijana, killing Agunloye, the Olu of Ilaro, and Abinuwogvo, the Onisare of Ijana, because these towns assisted Ibadan in the early wars of the 1830s between Abeokuta and Ibadan. In 1835, Adele, the exiled king of Lagos who was ruling Badagry during this period, assisted Egba in destroying Oyo power in the region by subjecting the town of Ota. The first Alafin was Oranmiyan. The last Alafin of the Oyo Empire was Oluewu. It was during the reign of Oluewu that the Oyo Empire was completely destroyed and Oyo Ile was abandoned.
Today, if you visit the site of old Oyo, Oyo Ile, you'll find ruins, crumbling walls, pottery shards, the whispers of a civilization that once shook West Africa. The Oyo Empire lasted nearly 8 centuries, from the 10th century to the 18th century, longer than the United States has existed. At its height, it controlled 18,000 square miles with over 1 million people. It was more powerful than any African force in the region. Its cavalry was legendary. Its trade network spanned from the Sahara to the Atlantic. It held mighty Dahomey in submission for 75 years. And yet, it fell. Not to foreign invaders, not to European colonizers, but to itself. To the ambition of Afanja, to the weakness of Awole, to the Muslim rebellion of 1817, to the betrayal of tributary states, to internal divisions that tore the empire apart from within. There's a lesson in that. Empires aren't destroyed by their enemies, they're destroyed by their failure to hold themselves together. But here's the thing, Oyo didn't die, not really. The Yoruba people didn't vanish. The cities founded by Oyo's refugees, Ibadan, Abeokuta, Ijaye, became new centers of power. The culture, the religion, the language, the traditions, they endured, they evolved, they spread across the world, carried by millions of enslaved Yoruba people to Brazil, Cuba, Haiti, Trinidad. The Oyo Empire practiced a religion deeply rooted in Yoruba traditional polytheistic belief, where they served different deities known as Orisa. Some notable Orisa include Sango, the god of thunder, Ogun, the god of war and iron, Obatala, the god of creation, Orunmila, the god of wisdom and destiny, with Olodumare or Olorun as the supreme deity. The Alafin was the spiritual and religious father figure of the empire.
They practiced Ifa divination, and later Islam in the 19th century, and lastly, Christianity during the later years of the empire's reign. Today, if you attend a candomblé ceremony in Salvador or a Santeria ritual in Havana, you're witnessing the living legacy of Oyo. Sango is still worshipped, Ifa divination is still practiced, the Yoruba gods live on. The political system that governed Oyo, the Idile, the Bele, the Adugbo, the Oyo Mesi, the Basorun, the Ilari, the Iwefa, the Eso, the Are-Ona-Kakanfo, these weren't just titles, they were a sophisticated system of governance that balanced power, maintained order, and controlled a vast empire without modern technology. The 8 provinces, Ekun Osi, Ekun Ibolo, Ekun Epo, Ekun Otun, Ekun Onko, Ekun Ibarapa, Ekun Igbomina, and Ekun Egbado, each with their own chiefs, their own armies, their own identities, yet all united under the authority of the Alafin. The Ajele, the Asoju Oba, the Abobaku, the Aremo, the Iya-Oba, these weren't just names in a history book. They were real people who lived, who governed, who sacrificed, who built something extraordinary. So, yes, the Oyo Empire fell. Its capital was abandoned. Its last Alafin, Olueu, left Oyo-Ile to the wilderness. Its cavalry rode no more. But the spirit of Oyo, that never died. The Onikoyi still held authority. The Okere still commanded respect. The traditions of the Bere festival, the Mole festival, the Orun festival, the memory of these ceremonies, these rituals, these connections between the earthly and the divine, they endure. And perhaps that's the real story, not of an empire's fall, but of a people's resilience, of culture's refusal to be erased, of names and titles and traditions that refuse to be forgotten. The Oyo Empire may be forgotten by history textbooks, but it should never be forgotten by us, because this is our history, and it's a history worth remembering. The modern city of Oyo, in Nigeria's Oyo State, stands as the successor to the ancient empire. The title of Alafin still exists today, held by traditional rulers who trace their lineage back to the kings of Old Oyo. From Oranmiyan to Oluewu, from the rise under Abipa and Ajagbo to the Golden Age under Abiodun, from the conquest of Dahomey to the loss of Ilorin, from 10,000 cavalry at their peak to 4,000 spears at their end. This was Oyo. Long may their memory endure.
Thank you for joining me on this journey of African history, philosophy, and mythology. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more videos on African history, philosophy, and mythology.